Thank you, Cheyenne. For change to happen, solutions need to be influenced and informed by those who understand it best. Up next is our panel of Gen Z changemakers here to discuss the issues that matter most to them and what it will take to work together to shape a better future overall. So first up, please help me welcome Lauren Maunus. She's the Advocacy Director for the Sunrise Movement. Ananda Bhatia, the founder and president of the Modernization Staff Association. Carly Matthews, Communications Director at the American Conservation Coalition. And Tegan Lecheler, Director of Finance and Operations at Social Equity in Education. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this conversation. So I want to start off by talking about and mentioning another Gen Z member that we've mentioned a couple times tonight, Congressman-elect Maxwell Alejandro Frost, who was just elected last week to be the first Gen Z member of Congress. He'll be representing Florida's 10th Congressional District. At a press conference this weekend, he said something really interesting. He said, "I've been asked a lot about what young voters care about. I don't think they care about anything different than anyone else." And he later added, "The difference is the lens in which they see those same issues." And I think that really gets to the crux of Gen Z. We care about the same issues, but we see it through a different perspective. So starting our conversation off there, I want to ask all four of you, what do you think is the most important issue to Gen Z, and how do you see that different perspective playing out? Lauren, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. And I'm glad you brought Maxwell Frost into this conversation. I'm also from Florida and had the honor to work with Maxwell kind of organizing in the past few years and then really encouraging this leap into actually being part of governing and co-governing with our generation. So yeah, I think growing up in Florida as a young person, I saw the realities of the climate crisis firsthand, and the realities of the climate crisis specifically intersecting with racial and economic justice. And yeah, I knew from a very, very young age that this was just foundational to my entire future moving forward, that every single other issue that I would ever experience, just living with every year getting warmer and every year getting more unstable and having disasters all around us, was just going to be the reality that I faced, and that I was not going to let people in power continue to harm our communities by giving more and more power to the fossil fuel industry. And yeah, as soon as I kind of understood the connections between people who were supposed to be representing me, but actually were representing people like fossil fuel executives who were just destroying our communities and our futures, I could not accept that. And so that is the issue that I work on, because it touches every single other issue we could ever imagine.
Yeah, I definitely think climate change is one of the first things that comes to mind, gun violence being another one. I mean, I think a lot of us grew up doing active shooter drills in school, and I think to that question, how is the lens that we view issues different? I just think that young people really think about the issues that are talked about all the time at national debates, on the House floor, as impacting them not just more immediately, but for the rest of their lives. And there really are, I polled some of my friends, some of my sister and some of her friends about what are the issues that matter to them the most, and they're saying the same thing that a lot of, I think people were talking about this last election cycle, like abortion, for example, are at the top of their mind. But the decisions that are made now are going to impact decisions that will continue to be made for the next 20, 40, 60 years. So it's going to have a really lasting impact, and that's what we're thinking about.
Yeah, I would echo, definitely climate change is top of mind for our generation. And as kind of the resident right of center person on this panel, I have to say, that concern crosses ideological differences, and young conservatives are really concerned about this issue too. But I'll add on, and it's not an issue itself, but I think that young people are really tired of nothing getting done, and our elected leaders, kind of leaning on rhetoric and what sounds good, and not actually, kind of reaching the hand across the aisle or, making that unlikely alliance and actually getting something across the finish line. So that's what my work focuses on a lot, is kind of building that bridge between conservatives, progressives, everyone in between, and ensuring that we can actually get a result out of this work.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot to add in terms of the issues we care about, just because everyone's kind of said the things already, like gun violence and abortion, mental health, of course, climate change. I think, though, how we differ in terms of our lens is that our generation seems to have a much more of a critical systems level lens. So we are, I guess, brought up having conversations about systems of oppression and about systemic level violence, and talking about intersectionality and the way that we experience different oppressions based on our identities and the intersections of those identities. So I think that kind of ability to engage in critical conversations around system impacts, that is how our generation views things differently than maybe generations before us.
I want to dive into something. All four of you mentioned climate change, the environment, of course, a very pressing issue to young voters particularly. And Carly, I want to specifically zero in on something you said. Young voters, Gen Z, they're just tired of things not getting done. So something that's unique about Gen Z voters is they believe they're a force for change. They see labels less. They're more open to people. Do you think that fostering that open environment could help break through the partisanship that we, quite frankly, all the time see in Washington? Do you think that Gen Z can be the ones to sort of force that through and get something done? Carly, we'll go to you first.
Well, I certainly hope so, and that's what a lot of my work focuses on. In fact, some of my coworkers were actually in Egypt at COP27 last week, and they did an event with Dream.org, which is Van Jones's very progressive organization, and they had really honest conversations about where there's overlap in our priorities, and where we have disagreement, what won't work for our collaboration. But I think that having more conversations like that is really important. Growing up, I hated conflict. It made me very uncomfortable. But as I grew into an adult, I realized I still don't like conflict, but I love conversations. And as long as someone's willing to come to the table and talk with me in an honest way about where they're coming from on an issue, I think that really makes a lot of change. And obviously it has to go beyond just that initial conversation, but that's how things get started. And I think that Gen Z is more willing to have those conversations. I remember being in college and having really, kind of hard political discussions, on my bed in my dorm with a friend who disagreed with me. So I think that, we can kind of break through that political noise and actually, find the common ground.
Lauren, I want to get you in on this because you're with Sunrise, obviously focuses on climate change and the environment significantly.
Yeah, definitely. I think building off what Tegan said, I think that we at Sunrise, and I think as a generation, understand that climate change was not inevitable. It was created by racialized capitalism, extracting our resources from Black and brown people's bodies and extracting resources from the land and seeing those things as inextricable. And then having people in power and systems that maintained these people in power, elite, white, descending from Europe men. And that's the way this country was designed. That's, the literal rules that determine this country and who has power. And yeah, so right now, I think we understand as a generation that we're facing the consequences of decades of an economic system that has given privilege and safety to a small number of people at the expense of a lot of other people, the majority of the world, and our generation is bearing those consequences. And so instead of seeing it as Democrat versus Republican, we really see it as we need to change this economic system. It is not working for so many people. It is really working for, 0.5, 1%, 5% of people. But I would say that is not working if we want a democracy. And so, yeah, and it is not working in terms of having a stable climate that we can live for multiple more generations to come. And so we need all of us that are experiencing the crises at our hands to join together and say, this is not working, and therefore what movements have always done is force the change we need. It's not which party is in power. Different parties have been in power while change has happened. It's social movements from the outside making it inevitable that transformation will happen through governance and other means.
All that said, I want to move into sort of the second phase of the conversation that I was hoping to get to. We established what issues are most important to Gen Z. Now let's talk about that advocacy. And I specifically, Tegan, I want to go to you first. A defining characteristic of Gen Z is that we're digital natives. We don't remember the time when there were no smartphones. Oftentimes, the digital sphere, the internet, is sort of thought of to have negative influences. But as we know as Gen Z, it can be used as a force for good. So Tegan, you previously organized with Gen Z for Change, an organization that is now a coalition of 500 progressive social media influencers. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think social media is an optimal way to reach Gen Z voters? And how do you think social media can be used to speak to non-Gen Z voters? How do you get mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa to understand that social media can be used as a force for good?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that social media is so loved amongst Gen Z is that there's no qualification in order to talk about politics or issues, right? Like, you don't have to have gone to Harvard to have a TikTok account. You can be in the streets filming what you're seeing, filming the march you're at, the rally you're at, or the violence that you're seeing, and sharing that with the world. And there's no requirement of, kind of these, institutions that maybe are not accessible to all people. You don't have to have wealth, you don't have to have privilege, you don't have to have these big names and institutions behind you in order to share information, to share your analysis, to share your perspective on social media. Of course, there's good and bad to just anyone being able to share their perspective, but I think that social media gets a bad rap from older generations, particularly because, like you said, we are native to it, but older generations maybe don't understand it. And I think that's kind of a human instinct to dislike or have negative feelings towards things you don't understand, right? I think, though, that one way that we can kind of bridge that gap and bring older folks into social media is simply by humbling ourselves, I want to say. Like, when when you're showing your mom, oh, this is how TikTok works, and you say things like, well, duh, or like, I can't believe you don't understand this, or like, no, like, this is a For You page.
We never do that. Why would you say we do that?
I do that. And I'm like, Mom, this is a For You page. Like, what is not making sense? But that obviously puts her walls up. She doesn't want to feel stupid. She doesn't want to feel dumb. She's my mom, right? And so I think just like coming and being willing to have conversations and not make people feel less than, make people feel uncomfortable, and just really, kind of level the playing field and seek to genuinely meet people where they're at and show them how something can be a tool for them and what they're interested in as well, is a way that we can bring other generations onto social media.
That's a really good point. I want to get to we're running out of time, but I want to get to the third prong of this idea that I wanted to get to was we've spoken about what issues Gen Z cares about. We've spoken about how they advocate for those. What about now how they become a force for change? And one way to do that through civic participation is actually getting involved in politics, running for office as we saw this cycle, but even just working in the Capitol, let's say. So Ananda, I want to go to you with this. Gen Z is more pro-government, and that can be a real opportunity. People seeing Washington as a force for change and not just a place where there's partisan gridlock. So you work at the Modernization Staff Association. So tell us a little bit about what the group is working on, and where do you see reforms headed? And I specifically want to zero in on coming out of the pandemic, which had an outsized role on young voters, on Gen Z. How is your organization working to foster that face-to-face communication, especially after we had 2+ years of this virtual lifestyle? Because at the end of the day, politics is about people.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Staff Association, I founded it a few years ago. It's bipartisan, bicameral, and it's really about empowering junior staffers and making their lives easier on Capitol Hill. So we focus on a lot of issues that matter to junior staff. It's everything from the simple day-to-day tasks that they're working on, like tours or flags, constituent requests, that sort of thing, making those processes easier and more streamlined. A lot of things on Capitol Hill are still pretty old systems. A lot of things are done on paper, so just bringing that a little more into the 21st century. And then issues that just impact junior staff, their mental health, making it easier to create a pipeline to getting onto Capitol Hill. So we've got a staffer who's working on going out into communities, college campuses, and educating young people about how to get into government if that's something that they want to do. So to bring down some of those barriers. So some of the things we're really working on, like you pointed out, the pandemic was really difficult for Hill staffers, definitely for the younger ones who are often the people who are on the phones talking to constituents. So during the pandemic, you were taking all of these phone calls that were often really difficult conversations from your house without any support system or anyone else to talk to. So now that we're back in person, the number one thing that junior staffers are asking us to do is to just form connections with other staff, to get to know other people, to have a network so that they can bounce ideas off of them, have a support system. So we're working on, making it easier to do that.
The last question I want to get to before we go to the audience is, let's bring the conversation back to where we started, Maxwell Alejandro Frost, because he's just such an important figure for Gen Z. How important is Gen Z representation in government? And as more people who are part of Gen Z become of age to vote, they're going to become more of a formidable voting bloc in politics. So what role will Gen Z play in future elections? And are we at a change in paradigm right now with Gen Z becoming more involved in politics? I would love to get everyone's take on this, but if we can just keep the answers short. We can start over here, Lauren.
Great. Yeah, so we just saw last week, keeping track of, wow.
It's been a busy month.
Yeah, this was the highest turnout for a midterm election in the past 30 years because of the participation of Gen Z. So I think it's undeniable that we are a serious majority voting bloc in the electorate. And with that comes tremendous power and leverage that we will use as a generation to make sure that our issues are at the forefront. And yeah, I think it's absolutely critical that we actually put ourselves in power and co-govern and build voting blocks and majorities and people that feel accountable to our movements and our generation, and not just at the federal level, but in state houses, in courts, in school boards and city councils. So we at Sunrise are working to do just that and make sure we get people from our movements and our generation into all levels of government.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. I mean, you need representation to get things done. One thing that I'm a little worried about is that I think, Gen Z, we have very high standards, we're very passionate, but sometimes we look a little bit for that ideological purity that makes it more difficult to get things done. So I do worry that, I started off in college campus organizing, that was my first career, and I think a lot of young people, if they don't see a candidate that perfectly aligns with their values, they sit it out, they don't vote. So making sure that people know that, if you give up your voice, then you're giving up your power, and that it's just really important to stay involved no matter what, and that's the only way we're actually going to continue to see this kind of change.
Yeah, and I would just say, as a conservative environmentalist, young conservatives are so much more likely to want environmental solutions than their older counterparts. So it's really important that we have young conservatives, kind of the next generation of our movement, running for office and proposing solutions.
Yeah, I would just say the disability rights movement has this really awesome saying that says, nothing about us without us. And I hope that the election of Maxwell Frost is kind of our first step in that direction of embodying that line as Gen Z politicians.
I think we'll try to sneak in one audience question if anyone has anything for our fabulous panelists.
Hi, thank you for a great panel. I have a question. As you uplift the positives of the use of social media, what do you do in your own work to combat, the pandemic of mis and disinformation and how that's been harmful, as well as the mental health effects on young folks? And then secondly, I haven't yet heard anybody talk about the influence of money in our political system versus the power of Gen Z. Love your thoughts on that.
Anyone in particular want to take that?
I can talk about money. I don't use
We could
social
talk about
media.
that for a whole other event.
I don't really use social media that much, so everyone else here can talk about that. But yeah, I mean, I started with my own politicization and how I got into this work through understanding the corrupting power and just the scale of money, especially in our work on climate from the fossil fuel industry, and how much control they have over our politicians. And really, I think a main goal of Sunrise was really understanding the tremendous power and stranglehold that they have had over our politicians, and the lies that created and misinformation that we were told about the role of fossil fuels and denying the climate change and everything. And so, yeah, we have to build a movement loud enough and louder than all the money of the fossil fuel industry. And that's basically like the way that we will force the transformative change that we need.
Does someone want to take the social media part of it?
I can start and just say that, yeah, I had a great college professor who would start every class, he would go through students' social media accounts, and he would pull up something that they posted that was absolutely not true at all from both sides of the aisle and share it with the class and make them defend why they decided to reshare that post. So I think, yeah, it's pretty intense. I know. But it just really opens your eyes, because it's really easy to just assume that not just the things that you're reading in general. I mean, I think that we as Gen Zers sometimes feel like we're immune to some of the disinformation. We're like, oh, well, I grew up with the internet. I understand, what is a good source of information, what isn't. But to see your peers sharing the same kinds of things and not realizing, it was really eye-opening. So I will say one of the benefits of social media that I've definitely seen is, it really has gotten younger people so much more involved in politics at an early age. I mean, I don't think I was very politically involved until at least high school, certainly college. I mean, my younger sister was really invested in what was going on in the world back in middle school, and I think social media is the big reason for that. So I think, we've got to stay vigilant, but it's definitely got its pros and cons.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for being here.
Fabulous guests this evening. It's been amazing to hear everyone's thoughts and perspectives on Gen Z and their impact on politics here in the United States. That brings us to the end of our program. On behalf of the Hill and the Walton Family Foundation, we'd like to thank everyone who joined us here in person and to those who are watching online. If you missed any portion of tonight's program and discussion, the full event will be online in a few minutes or an hour or so. It'll be available on thehill.com shortly. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your night. For those who are staying here at Longview, we hope you'll stick around for the party. We have a bar in the back with drinks on the house, and our DJ, Miss Her, will be spinning the rest of the night. Come on back.